Plenary 4 will now begin. I would like to pass the mic on to the moderator of this session, Professor Kwak Pyong-jin, Chief of the KAIST Finance MBA, who will be leading a discussion on green finance and ESG.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Did you have a nice meal? It is a great honor to host this session, Green Finance and ESG. Achieving a carbon neutrality target in 2050 is not only very challenging and debatable in some sense, but also it is very, very costly task. So, to achieve this goal, a lot of financial resources are required. So in this session, we will discuss the ways to develop, stimulate, and vitalize green finance and eventually invest more financial resources into green industries to accomplish a carbon neutrality target. We have two main presentations from two international organizations, GCF and IFRS Foundation. And also we have three discussions from Korean government, Korean National Fund Service, and our Korean Environment and Energy Research Institute. Let me introduce the first presenter, Dr. Oyun Sanjasren from GCF. Dr. Sanjasren is the Director of External Affairs of GCF, where she leads the fund's work on resource mobilization, partnerships, communications, and advocacy. Before she joined GCF, she served as the first president of the UN Environment Assembly. She is an advisory board member of the Future Earth and served as chair of the Global Water Partnership. As one of the leading politicians in Mongolia, she served as a member of parliament, as Minister of Environment, Green Development, and Minister of Foreign Affairs. Dr. Sanjasren has a PhD in Earth Science from University of Cambridge. Please welcome Dr. Oyun Sanjasren.
Good afternoon, distinguished guests and participants. It's a great pleasure to be part of the Seoul Climate Energy Conference, and the Green Climate Fund, who I represent, has been also, I think, a part of the conference already for the last few years. So we're very happy to be part of this, and congratulations to the organizers as well. So I have a few slides, and I know that Anya will help me to project those slides. At the outset, I would like to congratulate again the Republic of Korea for the 2050 carbon neutrality pledge, but also not only pledging, but also adopting the needed legislation to support its pledge. We deeply believe that the Republic of Korea can be pioneer and leader in climate and environmental multilateralism to pave the path to green resilience for most vulnerable beyond just Republic of Korea. We know that it's demonstrating leadership, stepping up its climate action, both domestically, but also globally. And the Green Climate Fund is one of the clear examples of Korea contributing to international efforts to raise the climate action in many developing countries. And that is not only by hosting GCF in Korea, but also being one of the main contributors and having a very active seat on our board as well. First of all, I would like to, of course, and all of us, I'm trying to move to the next one. Okay, all of us, of course, followed the COP26. The outcomes were very ambitious. Of course, net zero commitments from many countries, enhanced NDCs, albeit not sufficient. Countries need to come back in 2022 with revised ambitions, which is also good because we don't have to wait for 5 years, but the idea is to put the pressure every year. Greater action, of course, to regulate methane and deforestation and move away from coal. Agreements on standards for international trading and emissions reduction credits was also progressed with Article 6. And of course, we're also very carefully watch the announcements of global financial institutions, G-funds, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which has 130 trillion worth of assets under management, announcing to strive to align their decisions and investments with Paris Agreement and net zero pathways. Of course, there has been a lot of progress. At the same time, we all know realistically that there are a lot of challenges as well. And one of those is, of course, that the impact of those announcements will remain limited until pledges are translated into concrete actions and national laws as well. And again, I commend Korea for being one of the very few countries. And if I'm not mistaken, only 14 countries so far around the world has actually passed the climate legislation. The global risks are now being dominated by inability to respond to climate change, natural disasters, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss. And of course, those of you who have been following the global risks report of the World Economic Forum, we know that just a few years ago, maybe even 6-7 years ago, this environment and climate-related risks will not be on the top of the global risks. There will be sort of traditional security, economical, financial, and other risks, and of course, the other traditional risks. But more recently, of course, for example, these 5 are the top global risks from 2021 report as well. And so no doubt that the current decade, 2020 to 2030, is going to be very crucial. Everybody is saying it's a decade for nature and climate action. But of course, the need to halve emissions in the next decade, halve again the decade after, and reach net zero by 2050, but also reverse biodiversity loss, are really enormous tasks. But many believe, and rightly so, that it is also going to be a disruptive decade, with innovations and technologies that will be needed for a major scale transformation required to limit dangerous warming. There are also opportunities to get the recovery right, to shift the development path towards sustainable growth. And that's why this race to net zero, this major momentum is being built in the last 12-18 months, with not only 140 plus countries, including the major economies, but also private sector very much joining, and also most importantly, public support growing, especially from the new generation. And of course, these are consumers and global citizens. Now, the finance is, of course, is key to catalyze and lead to the systemic changes. Financial sector has been seeing major changes, as also previous speakers this morning indicated. Banks, investors, financiers, asset managers, many started aligning their policies and actions with SDGs and Paris Agreement. And for example, more and more, of course, there is a requirement that companies reflect the risks and opportunities related to climate change in their risk management and decision-making. At the Green Climate Fund, where the key financial mechanism or instrument of the Paris Agreement, and we've been working with developing countries to channel the international climate finance to most transformative climate projects, both in mitigation and adaptation. By now, we became one of the top providers of multilateral climate finance, and our portfolio has grown to almost 200 projects worth of $37 billion US, and with co-financing, of course. Our share of financing is about 10 billion, but with co-financing it's 37 plus billion, and it is in 130 countries. So hence, because we work with developing countries, I would like to focus actually on climate finance that is potentially needed for developing countries. In the lead to COP26 and during COP26, many countries made ambitious climate finance pledges. For example, beyond the major Build Back Better domestic framework and investments of 555 billion proposed by President Biden domestically, and that was to be dedicated to climate investment. Also, President pledged to double its international climate finance contribution to 11.4 billion a year by 2024, and that should also include 3 billion to support adaptation efforts. Canada also announced that they will double to 5.3 Canadian US dollar billion. Italy committed to tripling, And then some of the numbers are here on this slide. In the next 5 years, New Zealand, ahead of COP, also pledged to increase the climate finance fourfold over the next 4 years. And Swedish government announced its intention to double official development. But then, of course, that also includes 50% of adaptation finance as well. So there was a lot of also focus, as we all know, on adaptation. OECD DAC members, and we also know, of course, Korea being one of those 30 member countries, issued a joint declaration ahead of COP26, committing to align official development assistance, which totaled in 2020 to 161 billion, with the goals of Paris Agreement on climate change. So, of course, we know that the importance of reaching the target of $100 billion of climate finance to developing countries that was promised to be delivered by 2020, that has not been reached. I think it reached almost 80 billion, but hasn't reached 100 billion by 2020, but is likely now to be reached by 2023. So I think the trends are on one side challenging, but at the same time, as we've seen with those announcements, the trends are positive and encouraging. However, we all know that even if we reach 100 billion in climate finance annually, and even if all the ODA, for example, gets aligned with Paris Agreement, the public money will not be sufficient to make the major transformational changes and systemic changes. The value of climate finance opportunities in developing countries between now and 2030 are estimated to be $23 trillion. And again, at the GCF, we see that really political momentum, but also all the opportunities, finance opportunities for greener, cleaner investments are being built, because we get a very strong pipeline of project proposals coming GCF way. At the same time, of course, we see $18 trillion of negative yielding debt in OECD countries. So one would have thought that the flow of climate finance should logically and naturally flow from OECD countries to developing countries. And that would be a natural win-win for both climate action and green recovery measures. But of course, this is not happening. And that's because of perceived risks. Green investment tend to have high upfront capital requirements, longer payback periods, have higher perceived policy, technical, operational investment risks. But at the same time, of course, they can also bring returns if invested smart, and if externalities are taken into consideration, and if public and international finance helps and de-risks those investments. So at the Green Climate Fund, we try to do exactly that, and that is to help to use new financing instruments, of course, grants, but also the standard instruments for the development finance, of course, grants, concessional loans. But beyond that, of course, it's very important to have more financing innovation. And by that, we mean blended finance, equity, guarantees. And we also know for blended finance, where private finance is mobilized through public funds to share risk and crowd and private investment, mostly more than 95% of blended finance happened, again, in the form of relatively safe senior debts directed towards mature technologies, such as on-grid renewable energy in mature markets, rather than nascent technologies, notably in adaptation, in nascent markets. And these are mostly, of course, in developing countries. And therefore, for GCF, and then we feel with our experience, it's very important for any public funding, international development, but also international climate funding that is coming through the MDBs, etc. It's very important that the innovative financing instruments are used. So we can structure financial support through a flexible combination of grant, concessional debt, guarantees, equities to leverage blended finance. And this flexibility allows to pilot new financial structures to support green market creation. We can accept higher risk to support early stage project development, as well as policy, institutional, technological, and financial innovation. I'm not going to go through examples. Please feel free to visit our website. All the detailed information about all the projects on our website, and by now we have 190 of those projects. But one thing I just wanted to emphasize towards in conclusion, that our experience is that just increasing volume of finance is not sufficient. Innovation is also needed in policy and regulatory institutions, also technology, and that's also financing is needed on capacity building, on national planning, whether it's for NDCs or adaptation. Also, we need to innovate the institutions as well. So that's also where finance needs to go, including on project preparation as well. In conclusion, I would like to state that millions and billions that will be made available of public and international climate finance will have to catalyze the private sector investment so that we can help to shift by those billions, trillions of financing needed to finance the major transition to net zero. And of course, very importantly, we must not forget that adaptation needs of most vulnerable also need to be financed. There's a probably mostly going to be also concessional and grant finance. And this is also essential. And even though we're trying to catalyze private investment, blended finance, we're also funding 50% of our funding goes for adaptation in most vulnerable countries as well. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjasren. She introduced the financial investment in green sectors. To save the time, we will get back with the questions later on. Please excuse us, Dr. Sanjasren. The remaining presentation and discussions will be delivered in Korean. However, the translation services will be provided. Stay tuned.
Thank you.
Let me introduce the second presenter, Dr. Sugun Kwak from IFRS Foundation. Dr. Kwak is a trustee of IFRS Foundation and a professor emeritus at Seoul National University. He taught accounting as a professor at Seoul National University and served as a board member of International Accounting Standard Committee representing Korea. He also served for Korean government and Korean Accounting Standard Board as chairman or a member of various committees. He has real business experiences participating in many Korean companies as an independent director. Dr. Kwak has a PhD in accounting from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Please welcome Dr. Sugun Kwak. 안 들립니다. 마이크가.
Dr. Kwak, I believe that you have been
박수근 이사님
muted.
소리가 안 들립니다.
Dr. Kwak, you've been muted. You need to unmute yourself.
됐습니까?
Can everyone hear me now?
네네, 죄송합니다.
My
여러분들
apologies.
반갑습니다.
Good afternoon, ladies and
제8회
gentlemen.
서울 기후 에너지
I would like
컨퍼런스에서 오늘
to
발표하게 된 것을 아주
congratulate on the opening of the
영예스럽게
8th
생각을
Seoul
합니다.
Climate Energy Conference, and it's an honor for me to be able to make the presentation. I am a trustee of the IFRS Foundation, and that is why I've been invited to make a presentation. COP26 there was a presentation or announcement of the IFSB at COP26. I'm talking about the background and the future actions related to the IFSB and the Korean measures. I only have 10 minutes, so I will not be able to go into the details. I will try to only cover the main topics. And if you would visit the foundation's homepage, I believe that you will be able to get more detailed information. And the International Sustainability Standards Board was established in relation to the actions or activities of the IFRS. IFRS has a three-tier governance structure: monitoring board, trustees, and ISSB. IASB. Now ISSB has been added to this governance model. For more than 20 years, the organization has been developing global accounting standards. Through due processes, the organization was able to develop high quality standards, and that is why the foundation was recommended. And the standards are already being used at over 140 jurisdictions. And the sustainability standards, there was a consensus, can be better accepted as IFRS already has been active in over 140 jurisdictions. That's that. In the past, companies have been doing CSRs or the CSVs. And it was up to the companies to do the types and the amount of CSRs. But in case of ESG, this is not up to companies. It's not a choice. And this is a demand by the market. The capital market has been applying pressure on companies to adopt ESG. And also, there have been increasing a request from different governments for the companies to take actions so as to deal with the climate changes. So there have been many different requests being made of the companies. And because of the various guidelines and the standards have been created and that have caused significant burdens on the companies. And so from companies' point of view, there was a lot of confusion because so many standards and the requirements were being created. And so there was a need to have a single set of standards. And if there were a single set of standards, it would help to reduce the costs of the companies and would also help companies to avoid greenwashing, and at the same time make it possible to make comparisons among the companies around the world, and then can provide assurance to the governments and also enable companies to create a digital reports based on the consistent and unified standards. So because of these reasons, ISSB has been created. And this process has been rather systematic. At G20 finance ministers meeting, as well as the central bankers meeting, there were a lot of discussions, and there were also recommendations that had been created by different stakeholders. And so those were, I believe, preparatory work to create ISSB. And all of these work has been done rather very quickly. And last November, there were 3 announcements. One is that to establish ISSB, and 2 is to create standards and the framework. And that is the consolidation with the existing climate disclosure and standard boards and reporting organizations. And third was to have a publication of climate and general disclosure prototype requirements. So there were a few strategic directions that were taken to create the sustainability standards. And one was to develop a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards. The financial reports of the past, we call them reporting standards. And all the companies had to abide by this single reporting standards. However, in case of the sustainability standards, because the scope is so wide and there's so much variety, and they were simply a disclosure guideline the global baseline of a disclosure of guideline, and also they could also the standards were given flexibility so that they can be customized to different needs of different companies. And everything is based on capital market. The investors have need for information, and that was considered utmost when creating the standards. And the companies or the stakeholders, well, there are many different stakeholders. They require a sustainability related information, and it is not possible to satisfy everyone. And so, first of all, we'll try to satisfy the standards, or is trying to satisfy the investors and the capital market first.
그래서 이러한 여러 기구들 저희들이
So these different organizations, well, we call this alphabet soup because there are so many different organizations with different alphabet acronyms. And I want to talk mainly about CDSB and Value Reporting Foundation. And so this is an organization that was born out of integrated ITP and IRF and ASB standards.
해오고 있습니다. 자세한 내용들 이어가지고
And if you want more details,
빼도록 하고 제가
please, as I said before, visit our homepage. And now I want to talk about what's important going forward. IFRS, it stands for International Financial Reporting Standards. And I believe that there could be some debate as to whether this name is proper or not. For now, we'll be using the name company's value, especially sustainable value. The accounting standards or accounting information is not enough to make that assessment. Companies' value, especially sustainable value, non-accounting, non-financial information also needs to be provided, and that is why IASB has been created. And for ISSB produced information and IASB produced information need to be connected properly or linked properly so the investors can make use of these two types of information to adequately assess the values of companies. So it's very important that these two different types of information are well interconnected. ISSB
두 가지 그 헤드쿼터를 두 곳에 지금 두도록
has two locations of headquarters. One is Frankfurt and the other is Montreal. And Frankfurt, the chairperson and the committee will be located, and there will be another headquarter in Montreal. The reason for this is to enable representation of two different continents and also to get more sourcing. And there will be an office established in San Francisco. SASB, that is Sustainable Accounting Standard Board, is located in San Francisco. And that is why San Francisco has been chosen as a regional office location. And there will also be another office in London to represent Asia and Oceania. The offices will be set up either in Beijing or in Tokyo.
앞으로 12월까지
So,
체어와 바이스
chair
체어가
and vice chairs will be appointed by the end of the year.
프로토타입으로 만들어진
And
디스클로저 스탠다드를
disclosure standards, that is the protocol, prototype disclosure standards will be created to receive comments, and advisory groups will also be established going forward.
완성이 되어 있는 그 계약들이
And also
법적으로 바인딩하는 계약들이 되어 있는
the contracts,
VRF와의
such as the we already have the contract to consolidate a CDSB and a VRF, and that consolidation will be completed by the end of the year. And there are a few things that need to be done here in Korea. Since the ISSB is established or is to be established in Korea, there needs to be a Korea Sustainable Standard Board has to be set up. It's not a fixed name, but and also Korea needs to identify professionals who will be taking part in the ISSB activities. And Korea needs to create standards that are more will be able to customized the standards that are to be produced from ISSB, and sustainable standards should be used by the companies, and they also need to be produced by the companies. And this sort of information need to be assessed and assured. And therefore, there has to be an organization that's going to do that sort of assessment and assurance work. And there also needs to be close cooperation with the relevant regulatory organization. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
He explained the why International Sustainability Standard Board is important, how it is actually formed, and then he discussed about the future steps. We will get back with some questions later on. Let me move on to discussions. We have three discussants. Let me introduce our first discussant, Mr. Lee Se-hoon from Korean government. Mr. Lee is the Secretary General of Financial Services Commission of Korean government. Mr. Lee served various positions within Korean government, such as Department of Finance and Economy, Financial Service Commission, and the Office of the President. He studied in law and also business at the University of Connecticut. Please welcome Mr. Se-hoon Lee.
예, 감사합니다.
Yes, thank you.
말씀드리려고 정보가
I would like to talk about how the Korean government is promoting ESG based businesses, and what sort of support and what sort of efforts are being made on the part of the government for the ESG activities. Last August, the Korean government has announced a plan to implement infrastructure for the ESG, and is also providing support to the companies so that the companies can do ESG management. And my organization, that is the FSC, is working closely with the financial companies so that these financial organizations can transition to decarbonization as well as to do more active ESG activities. We talk about ESG finance, we talk about green financing. We actually are doing three things. The finance, we are trying to propel them to move to more sustainable business. And the most important thing is that to set the standards for the scope of sustainable finance. We are working closely with the Ministry of Environment to develop what's called K taxonomy to define the scope for the sustainable finance. And we are also encouraging institutional investors to invest in sustainable businesses. We're trying to provide incentives to these institutional investors. And also what's important is a policy finance. In the past, we used a policy finance for innovation. Going forward, we're trying to make use of the policy finance in order to foster or to support a sustainable business. We also need to have the infrastructure for the sustainable finance. And what's really important here is to have ESG based disclosure standards, and also to manage risks of the companies as they still through these difficult times of climate change, and also how the market assesses the ESG activities of companies. We need to have the relevant assessment tools or the assessment schemes. So those are what I define as infrastructure. We're trying to also increase the awareness about ESG within the financial institutions and at the same develop capacities. And now many financial institutions are developing relevant ESG corporate policies and also developing training and education programs for ESGs. And we are also building a platform so that the ESG information can be shared between the financial companies and the government. We are also going to participate in the international aid for the ESG activities, and we're closely cooperating with the relevant organization. So I have talked about the kind of support that the government is providing to enable ESG systems and ESG activities. As we are in the still nascent stage of the ESG activities, there are many challenges that we face. And one is greenwashing, how to overcome greenwashing issue. And second is how to ensure that there is a carbon neutral financing. But the Korean industry has been very carbon or coal intensive. And so for the companies, that is the industries, to become carbon neutral, and thereby for the financial institutions to support carbon neutrality is a difficult challenge, but it's something that we have been working on very hard. But I do believe there has been increase, that is improved understanding about ESGs. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation.
He mentioned how Korean government actually moved to green industries and then changes industry organizations. Let me introduce the second discussant, Mr. Dong-seop Lee from Korean National Pension Services, which this organization manages more than $700 billion. Mr. Lee is serving as the head of Global Responsible Investment and Governance at National Pension Service. Before joining in National Pension Service, Mr. Lee worked for several Korean investment banking firms. Mr. Lee studied business at Chungang University. Please welcome Mr. Dong-seop Lee. Mr. Lee.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone.
소리가 잘 안 들리거든요. 좀 더 크게
Actually,
소리를
the voice is
키워주시겠습니까?
too small. Can you raise up the volume? Can you hear my voice?
소리가
It is still too small.
여기 테크니컬 스텝이 좀 해결할 수
So-
있는 문제는 아닌가요, 이게?
Is it possible to increase the volume? Hello?
말씀해 보시죠.
Can you say anything? Can
예,
you hear
잘
my voice?
들립니다.
Yes, I can hear very well.
소리가 또 안
Suddenly, I
들리거든요.
cannot hear anything.
그러면
If that's the case,
이
can you hear my
테크니컬한
voice
문제를
well?
해결하는
Before we
하는
fix the
동안
problem,
다음
I think we
디스커션
need to go to the next
디스커션을
discussant
먼저 듣도록
first.
하겠습니다. We will get back to Mr. E. Let's discuss Sung-Woo Kim, Dr. Sung-Woo Kim's discussion first. Let me introduce Dr. Sung-Woo Kim. Dr. Kim is the head of Environment and Energy Research Institute of Kim & Jang, which is the largest law firm in Korea. He is also a member of Carbon Neutrality Committee of the Korean Presidential Office. Dr. Kim played various roles in climate change and sustainability at many organizations such as GCF, World Bank, International Emission Trading Association. Dr. Kim has he studied in Earth and Environmental Sciences in Korea University and Duke University. He has a PhD in business from Seoul School of Integrated Science and Technology. Please welcome Dr. Sung-Woo Kim.
네, 감사합니다. 좌장님 혹시 제 목소리
Oh, yes,
잘
thank you.
들리시는지요?
Can
예, 잘
everyone hear me
들립니다.
well? Yes.
네, 우선 이렇게
First of all,
시적절한 때에
I would like to
녹색금융과 ESG라는 토픽의
thank
세션에
the
너무
organizers
감사하고
for
또
inviting me
오랫동안
to this very important
이런
conference,
기후
especially
에너지에
to
대해서
this
고민이
session
많았던
where we are discussing
우리들의
very
미래와
important, timely
카이스트에 주최하는
topic.
행사에 참여하게 돼서
And it's truly an honor
영광입니다.
for me to take part in this conference co-organized by Graduate School of Green Growth of KAIST and the Coalition for Our Common Future. I'm working at Kim & Jang, which is a law firm. So I have been researching the environmental science for the past 29 years. And in the past 2 years, I've seen a trend that I have not witnessed before. And the change, the speed of change is something that I have not witnessed before. It's something quite concerning.
슬라이드를 몇 장 준비했는데
I have prepared a few slides.
포스코에도 10년 있었고요.
I've worked at POSCO a few years, about 10 years, and I have also provided advices to different companies related to carbon neutrality as a member of Kim & Jang law firm. And so based on my work with the Korean companies, I have prepared this slide.
제가 공유하는 화면이 잘 보이시는지요?
Can people
예, 잘
see
보입니다.
this slide?
네, 그럼 저는 제가 주어진 시간이 한 5분 정도.
How much time do I have? Is it 5 minutes?
지금 그린 파이낸스 ESG가
And
탄소 시대에
so
어떻게 연결되고
I will talk very briefly about green finance and ESG in a carbon neutral era. I will talk about what companies need to do in this era.
이제 아시다시피
As you know,
탄소 중립을 선언하는 국가도 많지만
there are many companies that are declaring carbon neutrality. And also there have been over 5,000 companies that have declared the carbon neutrality. For companies to become net zero, they need to have strategies. They also need to have agreement from the BOD, stakeholders, and shareholders.
간단한 문제는 아닌데요.
And therefore, it's not an easy thing to make that declaration. And if you look at the industries,
비교적 용이하게
There are
달성할 수
some
있는 데도
industries
있겠으나
that can
우리가 볼
rather
때
easily or
상당히
relatively easily achieve carbon
걱정되는
neutrality.
업종도 탄소중립을
But at the
실현하기에
same time, there
그런
are
업종도 섞여 있는
companies
걸로
or the
봐서 이게
industries that
상당한
will be quite
대세는
difficult
대세인데
to attain a carbon neutrality. However, we
이제
do see
우리들이
companies in these
정부의
industries
시그널은
making
탄소
declaration for
중립을
carbon
하라는 정부의
neutrality.
시그널은 그동안에
The
제가 전문가니까
signals
볼 때
have been
이게
coming
엄청
from
충분했다 이렇게 볼 수는
government for
없는데
carbon neutrality.
그럼에도
However,
불구하고
those
이렇게
signals have not been
기업들이
what I
굉장히 어려워 보이는
see as
업종까지도
sufficient.
폭발적으로 탄소 중립을
But
선언하는
now,
데는
those sectors
ESG가
or the
자리하고 있다 이렇게
companies
보시는
that
게 맞습니다.
would have hard time
그러니까 ESG는
implementing
아시다시피 이제
carbon neutrality
이해관계자의
are saying that they will
비재무적
do the carbon
요구인데
neutrality,
거기에
and that
이제
is because
핵심적으로 요구를
of
가하는 사람이
ESG
주식이고요. 힘이
requirements.
강한.
And so,
그리고
and
핵심
state
테마가
shareholders that have been
기후변화입니다.
applying that pressure,
그래서
and of
것처럼
course the shareholders are applying that pressure because
클라이밋 액션
of
100
climate
플러스라는
change.
대표적인
A Climate
투자자
Action 100
연합이
Plus, which is an investor
기업들을
organization,
대상으로
have been
탄소 중립 관련해서 혹은 탄소
applying
감축 관련해서 인게이지를 해서
have been
이들이
engaging with companies
탄소 중립을
related to
선언하도록
carbon neutrality. So they have been demanding, have making demands on the companies to become net zero. So that's the strong signal that has been coming from the investors. And so the demand for the ESG has been moving very quickly. If you look at in case of market cap,
선언하고 있는데요. 이들이 주주들이라고 볼 수
or
있잖아요.
the no, let's look at the asset managers. So these are the major shareholders, and the
작년
AUM
말에는 9 trillion
of these asset managers has increased from $9 trillion of last year to $43 trillion in June of this year. So it's moved from it's not just billions of dollars, it's trillions of dollars, and such demand has become mainstream. And the fact that the asset managers are asking for the carbon neutrality, they are asking their portfolio companies to become carbon neutral. This is what this means. In case of the financial industries, I mean, of course, the financial companies can, their portfolio companies have about 700 times more emission than these financial companies. So it's for this to be really meaningful, these portfolio companies need to become net zero. So asset owners and asset managers, so these are the what I define as the investors, they are engaging with their portfolio companies, or that is to say the companies they're investing in, to become net zero. So in terms they are making active communication, they're even saying that they will retreat from investment if those companies do not become more carbon neutral.
예를 들어서 이제 주주 제한 같은 경우에는
In case of the shareholder resolutions, that is on the right upper corner,
유명한 스토리지만
this is a famous story. In May, at the shareholders meeting, there were small shareholders have made demands to have three independent directors to be changed. They were able to make that change because there was support from large shareholders, such as BlackRock. So this was something that happened for the first time in the world. And litigation. There were, of course, a lot of litigation in the past. They were related to loss and damage litigation. That's in the past. But the new litigation model you see is related to business models. And so there was this decision made by the court to reduce the carbon emission by 45%. So that was one of the results of the litigation. And so global companies are responding in these 5 ways. This is from our research center based on the information provided by the economists. So
그린
please take a look at
파이낸스가 백업하는
those.
슬라이드인데요.
And this
최근에
is
보면은
a slide that will
클린텍
back
벤처
up the
캐피탈이
green
상당히
finance.
빠르게
The
늘어나고
clean tech
있습니다.
venture
지금 이게
capital,
제가
as
딜
you can see,
밸류하고
is
넘버 오브
increasing. In terms
딜스를
of deal
최근에
values and
얼마나
in terms of
빠르게
number of
증가하고
deals,
있는지
you do
특히
see a
2021년
recent
데이터는
rapid
지금 9월까지만
increase.
산산한
And
건데
as for the data for
거의 작년
2020,
데이터
it's only up
1.5배가
to September.
넘어간
But
상황인데요.
that is also
이게
already
이제
1.5
이
times
기술
the size
가치에
of
대해서
last year, that is
굉장히 마켓
2020.
밸류가 올라가고 있다.
And
지금 보시는
so
것처럼
is the market value of these
테슬라의 뒤를
companies
잇는
are
이제
increasing.
자동차
You've
회사들이
heard about
상장하자마자 매출이
Rivian
없는 유의미한 매출이
and
없는데도
the Lucid
천만
that
대를
have not been
판매하는
able
회사의
to make
이제
much
기업 가치가
sales.
넘어가는데
However, since their IPOs, their
물론 거품도
market
껴있겠지만
cap
그래도 그 기업 가치가
have
한 번에 넘는 거는
increased
이제 어떤 시그널이나 방향성은
dramatically.
있는 것이니까요.
And that is because of the
근데 이제
signal that
저희가
these
이제 마지막
companies are sending,
슬라이드인데 이제
which
기업을
is to go
자문하면서 최근
carbon
기업 얘기가
neutral.
굉장히 많은 게 뭐냐면은
And
그래서 내가 무슨 기술을 사야 되느냐
so what sort of
이런 질문에
technology
답을 하는 게 되게
should
중요하고 왜냐면
companies
이런
buy? So
그린
that's the kind
파이낸스나
of questions
ESG의 흐름들을
that
바탕으로 기업이
we
행동을 해야
have
되잖아요.
seen companies
정부가
asking.
시그널을 충분히 주든 안 주든.
Whether the government is
그래서
sending
지금
sufficient
핵심 질문
signals
중에
or
하나는
not,
무슨 기술을 사야 되느냐,
what's really
무슨 기술을
important
확보해야
for
되느냐가 첫 번째
companies
질문이고
is to
두
know
번째는
what sort of technologies that they need to
경쟁사들을
buy or
참고해서
secure.
내가 지금 갖고 있는 기술이
And companies
얼마나 앞서가거나
also
뒤처져
need to know
있느냐 이 두 가지 질문에 저희가
where
지금 자문을
their
열심히 하고 있는 건데
technology
이게
falls
지금 이 마지막
as
슬라이드가
compared
저희가
to their
하고 있는 자문의 분석
competition.
예시입니다.
So
저희는
this
주로
is an
그
example of
IP
advice that we
데이터를
provide to our
질분석,
clients.
양분석을 통해서 이제 기술을
So
찾아주는 일을 하고
we
있어서
are doing this sort of
정부에서나
analysis
파이낸스에서도
to find
이런 흐름
the
차원에서
needed
기업의
technologies.
기술 찾아주는 일, 검증하는 일들을
And so
큰 니즈로 지금 갖고
there
있다라는
are
거를
needs on the part of the
좀
companies
참고하셨으면
to
어떨까
know
이런 생각에서
the technologies that they
정보
need
공유드렸습니다. 제
to
발표 여기서
become
마치겠습니다.
net zero.
감사합니다.
So with that, I would like
Thank
to
you,
conclude
Dr.
my
Kim.
presentation.
Previous three presenters discussed about the public sectors, but Dr. Kim discussed about how quickly private companies move toward the ESGs. Let me get back to Mr. E. Are you there?
네, 안녕하세요.
Hello
잘
everyone.
들리세요?
Can you hear
예,
me
잘
well?
들립니다.
Yes, we can hear well.
네, 국민연금 스타트
Okay.
책임실장
I'm
이동섭입니다.
the head of the division of global
연결이 좀
responsible
매끄럽지 않아서
investment at
죄송합니다.
National Pension. I
먼저
apologize for technical glitch. First,
말씀드릴 순서는
I would like to
국민연금이
talk
어떤
about
규모의
the
회사이고
size of the national
책임투자
fund
체계가
and
어떻게
what kind of
구성돼 있고
responsibility
그
division
관련해서
we
환경
have,
관련해서 기후변화
especially
관련해서 어떤
relating
활동들을
to
하고 있는지
environment
중심으로
and what kind of activities we are
설명드리도록
doing
하겠습니다.
for the environment
먼저
improvement.
국민연금의 책임투자는
First, our
그 기금의 장기
responsible
수익성과 재정의 안정성을
investment
위해서 하고 있는데요.
are
규모 자체가
doing
900조
has been
가까이
done
이제
for the
넘다
stability
보니까
of the
그
asset.
실제로
The
전
size is over
자산군에
900
대해서 전
million
세계적으로 이제 자산을
dollar.
소유하고 있는 그런
So
구조가
we
되어 있습니다.
have our asset presence
그래서
across the
국민연금의
globe.
책임투자는 일단 전
Our
자산과 전 세계에 영향을
responsibility,
준다라고
our responsible investment affects not just a single region but multiple regions. So let me explain what kind of principles we have or structure we have. First, we have an integrated strategy. So while making a decision investment, we consider the environmental impact. Second is called negative screening. Third is voting, and fourth is engagement. So we have four major principles. So if you see that each sectors, they have their own respective field of activities. First, let me talk about the integrated strategy. In order to integrate our strategy relating to ESG, first we need to do the evaluation, and we have our own internal evaluation system with 13 items and 52 indexes, which is used to evaluate our portfolio companies. And 12 out of 52 are related to environmental issues. Especially recently, we are trying to weigh on the climate change related items. So that's why we are seeing whether they are actively engaging in the international climate change effort. Second is negative screening strategy. In May 2020, we looked into the coal exploration and drilling activities And back then, all the coal-related plants were evaluated, and we decided to stop our investment in any coal plant in and outside of Korea. Portfolio companies that has anything to do with the coal power plant has been reviewed with expert and the stakeholders, so that what kind of procedures and what kind of investment proposal will make to those portfolio companies. It will be decided within this year, I think, and at the early of next year, we'll be able to provide some basic guidelines for such investment. Third would be the voting rights. We are exercising our voting rights across the globe, and in case of Korean companies, shareholders' right has not been exercised to that direction. But if you see the case of EU or US, you can see such an example a lot. When that kind of proposal is received from shareholders, we usually talk with the people working in the same industry to see what they have been doing. Usually, shareholders ask the company to improve the carbon emission reduction effort and look into their supply chain and make a report on it. So we compared the similar industries to understand the reference or standard of their activities so that we can accept the proposal or reject the proposal. Final one is engagement strategy. Our engagement has been mostly done with the domestic companies, but we will expand this effort to include overseas companies as well. And these engagements are mostly related to the governance, but going forward, environment and society will be all considered in our engagement effort. So those companies have high exposure to the climate change will be listed so that climate change related engagement can be expanded mainly for those companies. So we have 4 of those strategies, and on top of that, we are doing many international cooperation and domestic cooperation. And AIGCC is one example of the partnership we joined so that we can expand our partnership network. This concludes my explanation on our activities.
He discussed about the national pension, how national pension fund is managed related to ESG. Since we have a little time, so let me ask each one one question, and can you briefly comment on that? First of all, Dr. Sanjasren, as we can see from the current pandemic, COVID-19, the collaboration is critical to COVID, the global problem, especially cooperation between developed and developing countries. The leadership of the international organization can play a key role for this one. So how can GCF show the leadership to induce the collaboration among countries, especially between developed and developing countries, to achieve a carbon neutrality target? And also, what role do you expect from the Korean government to perform those leadership?
That's a very, very relevant and, of course, very important question. And of course, we all know that the COVID-19 has actually influenced quite dramatically the situation, financial and fiscal situation, especially in developing countries. Whereas the OECD countries could come up with the trillions of dollars in the green recovery measures, it was very, very difficult for developing countries. So what, for example, GCF has been trying to do is to adopt an approach. Well, the first one was sort of what we call adaptive approach, where, if there are complications or difficulties, challenges in implementing the project, then of course we will give some extensions or some additional funding if needed. And also the other, of course, approach was that whenever the pipeline of projects comes in, on top, of course, of climate rationale and the standard investment criteria that we use for our projects, we also, of course, spoke and discussed with our partners, accredited entities and countries, that it will be also best if this investment create co-benefits for COVID recovery, including creating jobs. So some of our readiness projects also included some of the readiness projects, which is also used for the planning processes, government planning processes, have been also used for planning green resilient recovery measures as well, for the countries to develop and implement those. And more recently, we've been also experimenting, not yet implemented, but discussing with some of the countries whether some of the innovative debt for climate, debt for nature swaps can be also discussed. So absolutely, it's very, very important that the benefits are both towards the climate, but also green resilient COVID recovery as well. Thank you. Over back.
Okay, thank you. It is quite difficult issues working with both developing and developed countries. Okay, next question is Dr. 곽수근 이사님 한국말로 질문을 드리겠습니다.
So I'm going to ask my question to Dr. Kwak in Korean. The Korean government had said that it wants to receive ESG report from all Kospi listed companies by 2030. And ISSB is preparing to establish sustainability standards. So what's the timeline like? As Korean companies are making preparations for 2030, what sort of work needs to be done on the part of those Korean companies? Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question.
이 ESG 관련된 정보
ESG
현재
related
공시하는
information.
지속 가능 보고서를 만드는 기업들이 한 130개 정도 되는 것
Well,
같습니다.
I understand there are 130 companies that are making ESG related reports, and I'm sure that in the future there will be more Korean companies that are issuing ESG reports. And ISSB is developing international or the global standards. And the Korean companies where the global investors are making investment in will have to disclose their information based on the ISSB standards. However, smaller companies, such as the SMEs, it's not going to be easy for those companies to make their disclosures based on the standards from ISSB. And I believe that this has to be a multi-phased approach. So initially, there has to be ESG-related standards from, for instance, KSSB and ISSB. And the companies will first voluntarily abide by these standards. And for those companies that are making high-quality disclosures, will be receiving good feedback from the market. And then they should, and I believe, initially receive incentives. That is to make a more standard-based disclosures. But for companies that is of certain size, they need to be obligated to make disclosures. And for smaller companies, it has to be voluntary. By 2030, important information, especially the information related to climate change, the Korean government will be making mandatory those information related disclosures, and the companies will have to prepare for that. Yes, thank you.
And next question would be Mr. Kim.
Well, Dr. Kim, you have talked about how quickly the companies are moving towards ESG and ESG related reporting. So what should smaller companies do? the companies that have not been covered in your presentation? Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question.
기업들이 지금 힘든 이유는
Companies are experiencing difficulties
것이 갑자기 와서
because the scope of ESG is so wide, and also because the ESG has come to them or has become an important issue for them in a very short period of time. So this is something that I say, when I talk to the BODs. I know I'm stating the obvious, but the companies need to find what's important to them. So when I do the training, I say that what's really important is the relevance, which means that the companies have to find something that is relevant to them as they try to deal with these disclosure issues. And in most cases, the companies have no choice but to do the transformation, and which means that all the companies need new technologies that will enable them to make those transformations. And as for those companies to prepare for the transformations, they need to be able to identify the technologies that will enable them. And there are more than 1.7 million patents on the technologies that are needed for the transformations. And so the companies need to know, what sort of technologies they have and also what kind of technologies they need to do that transformation.
The last question goes to Mr. Lee Dong-seop. As previous speaker said, in case of ExxonMobil, minorities proposed to change the members of the BOD, and that actually happened, but that kind of change is not seen in Korea, but it will come surely. So if you have that kind of opportunity to propose your voting right, what kind of principles you will follow? Do you have that kind of standard or principles? Also relating to coal power plants, you said that you stopped the investment into the new coal power plants. But what about the existing coal power plants? Do you have any additional strategies you apply to existing coal power plants? First, regarding the voting right, in case of Korean companies, shareholders' proposal is not as free as overseas markets. So I don't see any shareholders propose the first to change the members of the BOD or something else. But in case of the Australia or UK or US, that kind of proposal has been made actually. And one common phenomenon is that I do agree with why they propose and for what they propose, but actually companies are already doing so much extensive activities in the climate change related field, but they are seeing bigger demand. So if that's the case, we need to compare their case to the other companies of the same industry to understand whether the proposal is too much or not. And especially when it comes to the sector that are doing the sufficient effort for climate change, we don't agree with the proposal from shareholders usually. Also, in some cases, they single out a certain sector to propose the climate change actions, but sometimes they randomly propose their ideas to random companies. So we need to see each cases whether that kind of proposal is really necessary and relevant to a certain company or a sector. So that kind of evaluation are being done. Also, it is not just about a company, but sometimes they propose climate change actions to the entire supply chain. And from the perspective of company, changing the entire supply chain is not something possible. So if that kind of impossible proposal is received, we also do the analysis whether that kind of proposal is doable or can create any meaningful values to the market. So we do that kind of extensive kind of evaluation before accepting the proposal. Your second question about the phase out of coal power plants and extraction of coals, artificial plants.
저희가 이제 기업들을 이미 많이 투자하고 있기
And there are so many companies who are doing the investment, and if I make a sudden proposal to them to stop any investment in coal, that will create a huge implication across the market. So we need to be very selective, and we need to set the right timing. That's why we outsourced actually on research so that we can understand the situation. I think we'll be able to see the preliminary result as early as the early of next year. Mr. Lee Se-yoon had to leave because he had other important appointments. So I think this concludes this session.
This conference and especially in this session. Thank you.
감사합니다.
Thank you all for your presentations and discussions, which have elaborated on how the importance of environmental risks are being absorbed by and taken up by the financial sector, both in the public and private sectors.